October 1979. The patrol car of Sergeant Dan Hale was discovered idling on a narrow back road outside the town. Its headlights cut a pale corridor through the mist. The engine murmured softly, and the driver's door hung open, swaying faintly in the autumn wind. When fellow officers arrived, they found no trace of struggle, no footprints leading away, no signs of violence. It was as though the night itself had swallowed him whole. Only a single slip of paper remained on the dashboard. 4 words, written in hurried blue ink. Do not trust them. The question hung heavy in the chill morning air. Who was Hale warning against? And why did the rest of the scene look so untouched, so precise, as if the world had been scrubbed clean of answers? Before the empty car and the lonely note on the dash, there had been a man people thought they understood. Sergeant Dan Hale had long been a quiet fixture in town life. He was the kind of man who returned borrowed tools sharper than he received them, who never failed to wave to a neighbor, who kept his yard trimmed and his conscience sharper still. He was steady, polite, and carried himself with the calm discipline of a man who had spent his adult life in uniform. 10 years earlier he had come home from Vietnam. He spoke rarely of the jungle, of the rain, of the noises that woke him suddenly in the night. When pressed, he would simply answer that he had done his duty. But those who knew him best could see that the war had carved something permanent behind his eyes. A quiet vigilance, the kind that never really rests. On Sundays, Hale stood in the back of the small church, helping elderly members to their seats and leaving before most people finished their coffee. During the week, he was out the door before dawn, a thermos of black coffee in one hand, the other resting briefly on the shoulder of his wife before he left. He told her he liked to watch the roads wake up. The men in his unit described him as straight as a line. He wrote what he saw, and nothing more. He cut no corners, made no bargains, accepted no favors. The younger officers looked up to him as an example. The older ones sometimes avoided conversation, knowing he was not one to bend if things turned difficult. At home, Eva Hale often watched her husband with a mixture of admiration and quiet worry. She saw the way he folded laundry so precisely that every towel had perfect edges, the way he closed their sun-mixed bedroom door each night so softly that it never made a sound. She loved that steadiness, but she feared where it might lead. Once, over dinner, she told him that not everyone wanted the truth all the time. He had looked up, calm and certain, and said, "If a man starts choosing which truths to tell, he will soon forget what truth is." Eva carried that thought with her like a shadow. She saw the signs when something began to trouble him. The extra weight in his shoulders, the small pause before he placed his holster on the kitchen chair, the way he stared through the window long after supper had ended. In the department, rumors of unease began to circulate quietly. Hale had noticed shipments arriving at the freight yard that did not match their paperwork. Pallets carried the wrong tags. Trucks came and went at odd hours. He logged the details in his reports, aware that such observations could make him unpopular. At home, he mentioned them only in passing, small remarks over cold coffee or late meals. Once he admitted that he had filed something that might not win him friends. Eva heard the tension in his voice and told him not to push too far. He answered with quiet resolve that a man does not get to pick and choose honesty. The other officers knew his reputation and respected it, but some made remarks that carried warning beneath politeness. One told him, You are stirring trouble that is older than you." Hale heard the words, nodded once, and continued with his paperwork, as though nothing had been said. Unknown to nearly everyone, Hale kept 2 notebooks. The first was the ordinary pad every officer carried for routine notes. The second was private. Late at night, when the house was still, he would sit at the small workbench in his garage and write in a black cloth-bound book. When he finished, he would lift a loose square of concrete near the back wall, place the book inside, and cover it with a sheet of tarp to guard against moisture. The notebook was his insurance, a record of things that might otherwise disappear. His handwriting was careful and exact. Dates, times, locations, observations. A semi-truck parked at mile marker 19 that smelled of solvent, though it was logged as empty. A warehouse complaint that disappeared too quickly. A sergeant who bought a new boat, though his paychecks had not changed. Hale avoided direct accusations, but he underlined certain words in his neat hand. Badge, freight yard, watch who you call. On one page he circled a name, Lieutenant Ward Shaw, with no explanation. On another he wrote about Officer Pete Mora, saying the young man had a good heart, but should watch his company. As the entries went on, his pencil strokes deepened, the letters pressing hard into the paper. In one hurried section, the words leaned sharply to the right, the lines jagged, as if written in haste. Hale recorded that if he ever failed to come home one night, it would not be because of a stranger on the road. It would be because he had written things down and refused to let them vanish. Eva discovered the notebook only after his disappearance. At first, she entered the garage simply to feel close to him. She sat on his stool, touching the tools he had arranged so neatly, the wrenches lined in perfect sequence, the screwdrivers standing upright like soldiers at attention. That was when she noticed 2 boards near the back wall that did not meet cleanly. Curiosity overcame hesitation. She fetched a screwdriver and pried gently at the seam. Beneath the board lay a loosened square of concrete. Beneath the concrete, a folded tarp. Beneath the tarp, the black book. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first few pages looked routine. Plates, dates, incident numbers, but the tone shifted quickly. As she turned the pages, she felt the weight of something deeper taking shape. Hale had been building a record, piece by piece, of something larger than routine misconduct. It was a pattern, a structure of wrongs that reached inward toward the department itself. She read until her eyes blurred. Then she took out a pad of her own and began to copy. Line after line. She underlined entries about the freight yard and boxed the notes about radio calls that went silent. She copied the sentence where her husband had written that it would not be a stranger who silenced him. And she understood with a cold certainty that the book in her hands was both a confession and a warning. When Lieutenant Shaw called to check on her later that week, his voice was soft and official. He asked how she was holding up, told her the department would do everything possible. Eva listened quietly. Then, after a pause, she mentioned that she had found something in the garage. A notebook. Shaw hesitated on the line. She told him she would let him see it, but not yet. She wanted to read it first. He agreed, though his tone carried unease. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, the book open before her, and made a second copy by hand. Every page, every entry. When she finished, she sealed the copy in an envelope and wrote her sister's name across it. If the original ever disappeared, another version would live elsewhere. By dawn, she had read the notebook twice, from cover to cover. She slid it beneath her side of the bed, close enough to reach in the dark. For the first time since the call about the abandoned car, she felt less like a widow and more like a guardian. The black book was not just a record of her husband's duty. It was his final act of defiance against the silence that had swallowed him. The neighbors came, as they do in such times, with casseroles and soft condolences. Officers visited in pairs, speaking gently, assuring her that everything possible was being done. Eva nodded, accepted their sympathy, and said little. Inside, she carried the weight of what only she now knew. Dan Hale had trusted the truth more than he had trusted the men around him. And if his disappearance had been arranged, then the black book in her hands was both explanation and evidence. That morning, Eva decided she would not let it remain hidden again. Hale had written so that the record would not vanish. Now it was her responsibility to ensure that his words, unlike him, did not disappear into silence. The weeks before his disappearance had been heavy with tension, though she had not seen it clearly at the time. She remembered the way he came home later and later, the clipped tone when she asked about his day, the long moments at the sink when he stared through the kitchen window into the dark. She had chalked it up to the usual fatigue of police work. Only later would she realize that the storm gathering around her husband had been forming inside the very department he served. Hale had filed quiet reports that moved upward through the chain of command and never came back down. He had noticed missing evidence, trucks logged but never inspected, officers on duty during nights when warehouses filled and emptied without record. He had begun to link it all together: smuggling, narcotics, stolen goods, even weapons. It was not the crime of the streets. It was organized, deliberate, protected. One or two of his fellow officers had warned him in low voices over late coffee. They told him he was writing his own obituary. They told him to pick his battles. They told him some shadows were longer than others. Hale had simply nodded and continued to write. In the weeks that followed, Eva read the notebook so many times that she began to hear her husband's voice in every line. What once felt like a diary of duty now read like a trail of warnings. Each entry pointed inward, towards the people Dan had worked beside, toward those who had shaken his hand and wished him good night. The more she studied it, the clearer one name became: Tom Avery. Avery had been her husband's closest friend on the force. He had stood beside Dan at their wedding, had brought cigars when Mick was born, had repaired their fence after a spring storm. He was the kind of man who knew how to make a grieving house feel less empty. After Dan vanished, Avery had been among the first to arrive. He had carried food through the door, spoken softly to Mick, promised Eva that the department would not rest until answers were found. But now his name appeared again and again in her husband's hand, each time edged with darker ink. In one entry, Dan noted that Avery had signed duty logs that did not match dispatch records. Another page mentioned Avery's presence at a warehouse during an unscheduled offload. The handwriting on that line had pressed so hard that the pencil nearly tore the page. Eva read the words until her eyes burned. She remembered the night Avery had driven her to the station, insisting she should not see the car, that no wife should have to look at the seat where her husband should have been. At the time, his gentleness had seemed like kindness. Now it looked like caution. She closed the notebook and sat very still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a train. a realization formed slowly, painfully. If Dan's disappearance had been arranged, then the hands that made it happen might not have been strangers. They might have been the same hands that carried casseroles through her door, the same hands that had comforted her child. The book gave her more than names. It gave her a shape of betrayal. One line in particular would never leave her. Told to drop it. Will not. If anything happens, start with Avery. Eva pressed her palm to the page. The pencil marks had faded, but the meaning still burned. Her husband had left her a trail, and she had ignored it for too long. She began to replay her last conversations with Tom Avery in her mind. His words had been careful, soothing. He had said that men sometimes broke under pressure, that Dan might have needed time away. He had told her to trust the department, to let the process work, to have faith. At the time, those words had comforted her. Now they chilled her. One evening, unable to sit still, Eva drove across town to Avery's house. The small brick home looked exactly as she remembered. The curtains were drawn, the porch light glowed a dull yellow, and his patrol car sat in the driveway, with its antenna bent at a sharp angle. She sat there for a long time, engine off, watching the windows. Every so often, a shadow crossed behind the curtains. She could not tell if it was him or his wife, but her pulse refused to slow. Anger rose and receded like a tide. How could no one else see what Dan had written so clearly? Or had they seen it and chosen to look away? She finally drove home, the notebook heavy in her mind. That night she sat at the kitchen table again, the yellow lamp throwing its soft circle across the wood. The house was silent, except for the clock. She opened the notebook and stared at Avery's name. She pictured the patrol car, headlights carving the dark, the slip of paper with the words, "Do not trust them." She had always wondered who them had meant. Now she knew. The shadow was not outside the department. It lived within it. If Dan had seen that truth clearly enough to write Avery's name, then his disappearance was not a random act, not bad luck on a lonely road. It was deliberate. It was a message. Eva closed the notebook, her fingers trembling. She understood that she could not take what she had found to the police. To hand it over would be to place it directly in the hands of the men her husband feared. The only path left was the one she would walk alone. The betrayal burned inside her, but it also steadied her. She would follow the clues he had left, no matter how dark the path became. The department filed Hale's disappearance the way it filed dozens of others, quickly, neatly, without conviction. "Missing in the line of duty," the report read. Promises of follow-up were made, but no one mentioned the note in the cruiser or the strangeness of the spotless scene. Inside her home, absence gathered like dust, silent, heavy, and impossible to sweep away. Dan's boots still stood by the door, lined up as though waiting for a shift. His thermos sat on the counter, clean and polished, ready to be filled. Each morning Eva pressed his uniform and draped it on the chair by the window. It was not hope exactly, but defiance. If the world wanted her to behave as though he were gone, she would insist, through small rituals, that he still held his place. In those early weeks officers visited often. They brought food, shook her hand, spoke in hushed voices. Their eyes wandered through the rooms as if searching for something unspoken. They said Dan had been under strain. They said combat left scars. They said sometimes men simply walked away. Were they comforting her or building a narrative for themselves? Eva could not tell. She nodded politely and let them talk. When the door closed behind them, She opened the notebook again and read until the sun came up. She no longer looked for comfort. She looked for understanding. She began to see how methodical her husband had been. He had written not out of fear, but out of duty. The ledger was not paranoia. It was evidence. And evidence, she now realized, was dangerous. Weeks turned into months. The house grew quieter. The neighbors' visits became less frequent, their voices softer. At church, people prayed for her and for closure, a word that felt like erasure. Then one evening, while she was folding Mick's laundry, a sound interrupted the stillness, a light thump against the front door. When she opened it, there was no one there, only an envelope on the step, its paper damp from rain. No postage, no handwriting, except for the 2 words printed in block letters, "For you." Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short, written in a firm, unfamiliar hand. "Stop asking questions if you want your son safe." Eva stood motionless, the paper trembling between her fingers. The air around her seemed to thin. She looked down the empty street, the puddles glowing in the weak lamplight, and wondered who had left it there. A stranger? A neighbor? Or someone who wore the same uniform her husband once had? She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the letter. Every instinct told her to call the police. But which officer would take the report? Whose desk would it land on? Whose drawer would swallow it by morning? If the rot was inside the department itself, she would only be feeding their knowledge of her fears. So she said nothing. That night, she moved Mick's bed closer to hers. She left the hallway lamp on and told him it was for comfort. He nodded, too young to question, and fell asleep quickly. Eva lay awake listening to the small creaks of the house, each sound magnified until it felt alive. The hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of the wind against the window pane, the low ticking of the clock that once marked her husband's evenings home. She wondered if someone was outside, watching to see if their message had struck its target. By morning, her fear had hardened into something colder. Resolve. Silence, she realized, was not safety. Silence was surrender. She began to move carefully, asking quiet questions in places far from uniformed ears. She spoke to a retired dispatcher who admitted that radio static could be faked. She found a warehouse guard who mentioned trucks that came at strange hours, plates changed between arrivals. A clerk at City Hall recalled seeing signatures that never quite matched on shipping forms. Each story was small and incomplete, but together they began to form a picture. Still, doubt lingered. Was she following the trail Dan had meant her to find? Or was she walking one that others wanted her to follow? The threatening letter remained on the kitchen table under the weight of a salt shaker. She kept it there where she could see it each morning. It reminded her that she mattered enough to threaten, that Dan's truth still disturbed someone powerful enough to send a warning, and that her silence was their prize. Each time Mick was late getting home, her chest tightened. Each car that slowed outside made her lift the curtain. Every small delay carried the shape of danger. Late one evening she went into the garage and lifted the panel again. The smell of oil and concrete filled the air. She crouched over the hollow where the notebook had once been hidden and imagined Dan in that same position, pressing the book into the darkness, hiding it for her to find. He had known he was running out of time. He had chosen to leave a record rather than a mystery. She whispered his name into the stillness and closed the panel once more. The department's official line never changed. No foul play suspected. no further leads. To them, the scene had been too clean for anything sinister. But Eva had come to believe the opposite. Sometimes too clean is the dirtiest sign of all. So she continued her small rituals. Each morning she pressed his uniform. She watched Mick climb the school bus steps. She checked the locks twice. She copied the notebook again, this time by candlelight, committing every detail to memory. Her actions looked ordinary to anyone watching from the street, but each was a quiet declaration. If Dan had known enough to be silenced, then she would know enough to keep him alive in truth. By the early 1980s, Eva had learned to live within a rhythm of unease. Days passed in the house she had shared with him. The uniform still hung in the closet. The badge stayed framed on the hallway table. The official story remained fixed in police files. Sergeant Dan Hale missing in the line of duty. For the department, it was a closed door. For Eva, it was an open wound that refused to heal. And then, 4 years after he vanished, the first rumor broke through the silence. It was in the spring of 1983 when the silence finally cracked. A small paragraph in the back pages of the Austin Chronicle caught Eva's eye as she flipped through the paper over breakfast. The article described a convicted smuggler who, while attempting to bargain for a lighter sentence, claimed to have witnessed a policeman being forced into a truck near the rail yards in late 1979. The time matched the night Dan disappeared. The man said the officer had been pulled into the back of a dark sedan by 2 others and driven off toward the freight yard. He described the uniform, the flash of headlights, the smell of diesel and mud. One detail made Eva's hands tighten on the paper. The smuggler remembered the patch on the man's shoulder. The name was smeared with grime, but he was certain the first 2 letters were Ha. The police dismissed it within a day. Informants said anything to save themselves, they explained. But Eva clipped the article and folded it into the file she kept beside the ledger. Beneath the headline, she underlined a single question in red pencil. Why would a smuggler in another city remember that night so clearly? Years turned like pages. The 1980s passed in a slow rhythm of waiting. The neighbors learned not to ask questions anymore. Her son grew into a tall, quiet teenager who carried his father's mannerisms without knowing it. The straight posture, the measured tone, the habit of glancing toward windows before speaking. Eva kept going. She visited archives, spoke to retired officers, and spent nights at the library studying public records. Most doors stayed closed. Some people turned their eyes away the moment she mentioned her husband's name, but occasionally a small crack appeared. In 1992, at a police charity banquet she had attended reluctantly, she met a retired officer named Frank Yates. His hair was thin and gray, his uniform replaced by a suit that fit a little too loosely. When she introduced herself, his eyes shifted quickly, as if searching for an exit. "Harper," he began, then stopped himself. "Hale," she corrected softly. "Dan Hale was my husband." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he muttered something so low she almost missed it. He knew too much. Eva's heart clenched. "What do you mean?" But his expression changed instantly. He straightened, forced a smile, and excused himself to refill his glass. He did not return. Those 4 words stayed with her longer than any official document. He knew too much. If that was true, someone had made sure he never had the chance to tell the rest. By the mid-1990s, the folder Eva kept had thickened with scraps of information. half-spoken warnings, fragments of testimony, whispers collected from dark corners of conversations. None of it was proof, but it was something. Proof finally seemed close in 1994. A group of hunters stumbled across a shallow grave near the Blanco River. Local news reported the discovery before the coroner had even arrived. Skeletal remains, male, estimated to be in his late 30s or early 40s. A corroded belt buckle and bits of decayed fabric were found beside the bones. Reporters came to Ava's door within hours, asking if she believed her husband had finally been found. The department, too, leaned on her gently, warning her to prepare herself for confirmation. She waited for a week that felt like an eternity. She prayed for an answer, even as she dreaded it. When the call came, the voice on the other end was professional, careful. The DNA did not match. The remains belonged to someone else entirely, an unidentified drifter, long forgotten. For the department, it was another file closed. For Eva, it was another wound reopened. Every path she followed ended the same way, a door locked from the inside. She tried to stop searching, but the silence would not let her. 3 years later, in 1997, another lead surfaced, stranger than any before. It came not from a police source or a reporter, but from a veterans' shelter near El Paso. One of the coordinators, a woman named Helen Ruiz, called Eva late one evening. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "There is a man here," she said, "an older veteran. He says he knew a Sergeant Hale in Vietnam. He says he saw him after." "After what?" Eva asked. "After he disappeared," Helen answered. "He said it was in Mexico. Years ago." The next morning, Eva drove west through miles of flat desert road, the horizon endless and pale. She arrived at a small church where the shelter had been set up. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and bleach. Folding chairs scraped against concrete floors. The man sat alone at a table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug. His hair was white at the edges, his beard uneven, his eyes bright but restless, the kind of brightness that came from long years of surviving rather than living. When Eva introduced herself, he studied her face as though weighing memory against time. "You are his wife," he said finally. "Dan. We called him Steady Hale." Her throat tightened. "You knew him?" He nodded. "In Vietnam. We were in the same unit for a while." He hesitated, then added, "And I saw him again, years later." The story came out in pieces. It had been 1985, at a small roadside gas station outside Piedras Negras, just across the Mexican border. The man said he had been drifting, working odd jobs, living out of a truck. Late one evening, he stopped for gas. Under the flickering light of a cracked sign, he saw a man pumping fuel into another vehicle. A man in worn work clothes, his face thinner, older but familiar beyond doubt. "It was him," the veteran said, his voice shaking. "Dan Hale. I called his name. He looked at me, really looked, and shook his head once, not to greet me, to warn me." Eva sat motionless, every nerve awake. "Are you certain?" "I would stake my life on it," he said. He climbed into a truck and drove south into the dust. I never saw him again. Helen Ruiz placed a hand on Eva's shoulder and spoke quietly once the man left the room. "He has good days and bad days," she said. "Some memories drift, some hold fast, but he believed what he told you." Eva drove home through the desert with her thoughts circling like hawks. Could it be true? Could Dan have survived, forced into another life, hiding under another name? If so, who had buried him in silence, and why? When she reached her house, She placed the testimony beside the other fragments in her file. The smuggler's article, the retired officer's words, the negative DNA results. The pages together told a story that no official record could contain. A man who had seen too much, a department that had looked the other way, and perhaps a survival that had been punished with exile. She stared at the growing pile of papers. Each piece added weight, but none brought peace. The official file still said Sergeant Dan Hale, missing since 1979. But by now, Eva's private archive told a far darker story. A man who had uncovered corruption, who had been silenced with precision, and who perhaps still walked the earth under another name while the city mourned him as dead. The same question haunted her endlessly. If he lived, why had he never come home? The years that followed blurred together. She learned to move through life quietly, the way people do when the world has taken too much. She paid bills, attended church, sent letters, and each evening sat at the kitchen table with the file spread open like a wound that refused to close. Then, nearly 2 decades after the patrol car had been found on the roadside, a new envelope arrived in the mail. It was plain and unmarked. No return address, no seal, just her name typed neatly across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper from the city's police bureau. The language was cold and procedural. The file of Sergeant Daniel Hale, the original record still used his full name, had been officially reclassified. The checkbox beside deceased had been marked. There was no new evidence, no discovery, no explanation, only the slow gravity of time and the bureaucracy's need to tidy what it could not understand. Eva read the letter twice. Then she placed it flat on the table, beside the photo of Dan in uniform. The silence in the house seemed to deepen. After a while she picked up a pen, signed where her signature was required, and returned the form. The motion of her hand was steady. She had practiced steadiness for years. The declaration changed nothing. His boots still stood by the door. The leather cracked along the folds where his steps once bent them. His jacket still hung on the hook in the hallway, pressed and ready. Only the air felt different, as if something had finally stopped pretending. She looked toward the bookshelf where her granite-colored folder stood, thick with documents and handwritten notes. It was, she realized, the only thing in the house that still grew. Paper, she had learned, outlives almost everything else. The memorial was scheduled for early spring. The city workers had already set a low wall of granite on the courthouse lawn, the stone polished to a quiet sheen that held the sky without quite reflecting it. Names had been cut deep, each letter a groove that would outlast living memory. A simple program had been printed, folded, and stacked on a card table near the path. The preferred phrases had been chosen in advance: service honored, sacrifice remembered. The tone was careful and even, the way institutions sound when they speak to themselves as much as to the public. On the morning of the ceremony, the air felt undecided. A thin sun pressed through a high sheet of haze, and a mild wind lifted the corners of the programs. Uniforms gathered in rows, a dark horizon of cloth and brass. Some faces were young, carrying the bright stiffness of people who had learned procedures, but not yet the cost. Other faces were older, lined and steady, holding invisible ledgers of things done, seen, and regretted. Families clustered in small groups, hands linked, eyes scanning the stone for the right place to stand. Eva arrived early, alone. She wore a plain dark coat and a pair of black gloves she had kept in the hall drawer for funerals and cold mornings. In her pocket, she carried the badge that had once lived on the kitchen counter after Dan's shifts. She did not plan to show it. She brought it because it weighed exactly what it always had, and weight is sometimes a steadier comfort than words. She stood at the edge of the chairs, looking at the granite. She did not try to find his name. She knew exactly where it would be. When her turn came to speak, she walked to the small podium, placed her hands on either side of the wood, and lifted her eyes only once, just long enough to locate the point where officers met stone. She did not allow her gaze to drift. Her voice was low and even. She told the gathered crowd that Dan had not vanished because he faltered, but because he held to something the institution often avoids saying aloud. Turning away from rot is easier than cutting it out. His integrity had carried him further than any shift, and the cost had followed. Justice, she said, still owed him an answer. She did not dramatize. She did not beg. The words landed flat and final, the way a gavel sounds when there is nothing more to consider. Applause rolled through the crowd in a soft murmur and died there. A few officers lowered their eyes. A few lifted their chins. The press wrote down a sentence that fit the space above a photograph. The wall gave back nothing. It held the weather and absorbed the small sounds of shoes on grass and carried on being a wall. The next morning, the house returned to its ordinary noises. The heater clicked. The refrigerator hummed. A chair slid and settled back under the table. Eva unlatched the door to let in the pale light, and there it was, a manila envelope leaning upright against the frame, as if it had grown directly from the wood. No postage, no return address, no mark of a mailbox. It had been placed, not delivered. She carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table with the care of a person who has learned that anything flat and paper can cut in unexpected places. Inside was a single Polaroid. The colors were slightly dulled, the edges browned by age, the gloss worn to a satin by long handling. A slim man stood at a gas pump beneath a sign in Spanish. At the corner of the white border, a date had been scrawled in impatient handwriting that had never intended to be seen by anyone else. 1985. The clothing was unremarkable. A cheap work shirt, faded jeans, a cap turned down against the sun. It was the posture that took her breath, the set of the jaw, the way the eyes seemed to scan without turning. The camera had caught more than the subject. It had caught the habit of a man who had learned to look in all directions without appearing to move. The face was thinner. The eyes held new distances. But the man on that island of concrete was Dan. She did not faint. She did not even sit at first. She stood still for a long moment, then carried the photograph to the table and placed it flat, away from the steam of the kettle, arranged so that the light from the window fell across it evenly. She studied the corners first. Emulsion ages in certain ways. The small tear along the lower edge suggested years spent sliding in and out of a glove compartment rather than resting in a box. The ink of the date had bled slightly into the glossy layer, which meant heat, which meant a vehicle, which meant motion. The angle of the shadows confirmed a western sun. The image was a story. The story was not simple. Who had taken the picture? Who had kept it for a decade? Who had chosen this exact morning, one day after the city carved his name into stone and declared the matter settled, to place it against her door? Help or pressure? Signal or game? The questions arrived with the steadiness of rain and pooled in the center of her mind. She did what she had taught herself to do. She filed the object not according to what she wanted it to be, but according to what it could make other people admit when properly placed. She had a thin sleeve in the granite folder that she reserved for leverage. Not rumor, not generous inventions, items that resisted being explained away. She slid the Polaroid inside, marked the tab with a red dot, and returned the folder to the shelf. The gesture was small, but she felt alignment click into place. Somewhere, someone had made a choice. So could she. That evening, Mick returned from work. He was no longer the boy who had looked up each night for the click of a door that never came. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered young man, with a habit of standing slightly back from groups, the way a person does who has learned that listening is a form of protection. He had grown up in the shadow of a badge with no owner, and that shadow had shaped him more than any lesson. He looked at the clear space on the table where papers usually lay, and at the stillness in his mother's shoulders. He asked carefully if something had changed. Eva told him what had come, as she would review a bank statement. Facts first, implications after. The envelope, the lack of postage, the photograph, the date, the face, the habit of scanning without turning. She did not ask what he thought. She watched the way the words moved across his face. He listened without interrupting, fingers folded, one thumb moving slowly along the knuckle of the other. When she finished, he stood and crossed to the bookshelf where the folder lived, and ran a finger along its spine, the way a man tests a fence for current. He had been doing that since he had learned to reach the shelf. In the days that followed, Mick began to measure his life against a line that had always been there, faint and steady, and now grew darker. He had resisted the uniform for years, not because he doubted the work, but because he doubted the institution that had failed his father, and then declared the failure resolved. He had seen what that failure had cost. He had watched how his mother used paper to pry open seams in the silence. He had learned that there are officers who mean well, officers who mean comfort, and officers who mean control, and that sometimes they are the same men at different hours. When he told Eva what he had decided, he did it without theater. He would apply to the academy. He would take the oath that his father had taken. He would not wear a badge to inherit a tradition or to fill a space on a wall. He would wear it as terms he set with himself. If the job were done rightly, it would face the same shadows that took Dan. If the job were done wrongly, he would refuse to let the uniform be the excuse. Eva heard the argument more than the announcement. He was not making a point. He was making a promise. It did not ease her fear. It did something more practical. It gave her fear edges. She did not tell him that she was proud. She updated lists. She made a duplicate of the Polaroid, marked and dated it, sealed it in a separate envelope, and placed that envelope well away from the house. She adjusted her habits of watching the street. She walked to the courthouse lawn again and laid 4 fingers across the groove of Dan's name, not as comfort, but as inspection, the way a seamstress checks a stitch by pulling it gently and watching how the fabric holds. The academy was ordinary in the way difficult things often are. Early mornings began before first light. Muscles ached and then adapted. The study was exacting and ignored nostalgia. Mick moved through it with what instructors called composure, and what Eva, from a distance, recognized as an inheritance he had never asked for. He did not broadcast his last name, and when an instructor connected him to the man on the granite wall, he registered it and returned to work. When he was asked why he had chosen this path, he spoke of service first and of history only after. Eva tracked the calendar without hovering. She had learned to distrust stories that make heroes quickly and martyrs neatly. She kept to her tasks. She maintained the house. She maintained the file. She refused to arrange her days around the spectacle of her own endurance. On the morning of his graduation, she brought no sign, no ribbon. She placed Dan's badge in her pocket and kept it there, pressed into her palm out of sight as the ranks shifted and the call and response of ceremony moved across the field. When the formation broke, she did not press the badge into her son's hand. The past was not a prop. Instead, she said, in the same measured cadence she had used at the podium, that the name on the granite still had a watch running. If he meant to keep that watch, he would need to be exact. Life resumed its narrow rhythms. Mick reported for duty as a rookie in a precinct that had replaced faces but not habits. Eva returned to her table at night, bringing the folder out and laying it open with the practiced economy of a person who has learned that hours are not guaranteed and attention must be spent like money. The Polaroid remained the most unruly page. Some nights it read like mercy, proof that 1979 had not been the last line. Some nights it read like design, the precise pressure of a hand that wanted to see what moved in Eva when a wound was reopened at a moment of public closure. On the worst nights, it read like both. Its usefulness did not depend on what she preferred it to be. It depended on what it could compel others to admit. She began to learn where to set it. She learned which questions it could unlock and which doors it left shut. Who had held the image for 10 years? Who had chosen the morning after the memorial to alter the ground beneath her? Whether the act had come from a conscience frayed at last, or from a system still testing the bite in the name Hale. The questions no longer carried the same dread. Questions are tools when you are not standing alone. That summer was a heavy one. Heat pressed down and held. The courthouse lawn turned the color of straw. The wall dimmed to a dull gold in late light. Eva found herself drawn there in the evenings, after the shadows had lengthened and the square had thinned to tourists who did not know the names they traced with idle fingers. She would stand with her palm resting on Dan's letters and count her pulse until it slowed. On one such evening she noticed a young officer at the edge of the plaza, his belt still stiff with new leather, his stance that straight, wary line that all rookies carry until the work rounds it. He was her son, and he was also simply a man at the start of a job. She watched him for a moment and felt something shift inside that was not victory and not surrender. The official record would always say one thing: her file, her house, and the man who had chosen to stand in that light said another. Between those two truths lived the life she had built, a life that refused to let a clean scene mean an honest one, that used paper as ballast, that believed a watch can continue even when the watchman is missing. In the months that followed, small movements appeared where for years there had been none. Officer Pete Mora, the young man Dan had described as decent but unwary in his company, reached out to Eva quietly and asked for a meeting off-duty, outside the city, at a diner where the coffee was weak and the waitresses called everyone Hon. He sat with his hands folded, eyes on the chipped sugar caddy, and said that what he had suspected as a rookie had only confirmed itself with time. The names had changed on certain doors. The habits behind them had not. He did not give her long speeches. He asked precise questions. Had she ever seen a bill of lading with both sets of signatures in the same ink? Had the trucks in Dan's notes overlapped with the warehouse permits that had been renewed in a curious cluster in late autumn? For each question she had an entry, a photocopy, an underlined date. He took the copies she offered and told her he would move carefully. He had a child at home. He had learned to keep his head down and his notes exact. She recognized the echo and did not say so. Word reached her, in the sideways manner that truth prefers in guarded places, that Lieutenant Ward Shaw had retired to a house near a lake where the boats were larger than pensions explain. She did not go to look. She wrote his address in a small hand on the inside cover of the folder and left it there, an object that no longer needed checking to remain true. As for Tom Avery, he had transferred twice, laterally each time, his evaluations written in phrases that commit and admit nothing. A paragraph in a personnel file used the term pragmatic under stress. She read the words 3 times and found in them a shape of the man she had known. Mick kept his oath on his own terms. He was exact with his reports. He refused favors he did not want to owe. He took the calls everyone tried to pass off to someone else and wrote them with a steadiness that made some colleagues uneasy and others relieved. He learned quickly that there are days when the job is nothing more than hard work done thoroughly, and nights when the simplest call pulls at a thread that leads back into a room where lights are dim and doors do not open from the inside. He did not discuss those nights with his mother. He did not have to. Eva had learned to read the way men carry the end of a day in their shoulders. Autumn returned. The state fair came and went. The city went on being a city. The folder thickened by a few more pages, a few more copies, a few more notes made in a hand that had become both neater and more severe with the years. The Polaroid remained in its sleeve, a red dot bright against the grey tabs. Some afternoons Eva would take it out and place it beside Dan's badge and the letter that had threatened her son, and she would look at the 3 of them together until they felt less like symbols and more like tools. Then she would slide them back into their places and close the folder and return it to the shelf. One day, walking back from the courthouse square in late sun, she felt the thought form with a clarity that asked for no reply. Perhaps the photograph had been proof. Perhaps it had been a taunt. Either way, it had done what proof and taunt sometimes do together. It had reminded her that absence is not erasure. It had pressed the name Hale back into the present tense. That evening she brewed tea, set 2 cups on the table, and left one empty. It was not a ritual so much as a correction to the room's balance. She read for a while in silence, then took out a pen and wrote a letter addressed to no one. She wrote that she understood now that closure is a word most often used by people who need it for themselves, and that continuity is something else, something chosen daily and kept cleanly. She folded the page, slid it between the cover and the first divider of the folder, and felt the satisfaction of a drawer that closes flush. The phone rang once that night. A hang-up. She did not let it live inside her chest. She placed the receiver back in its cradle and turned out the kitchen light. The house settled to its utility noises. The watch ran. Weeks later, Mick stopped by after a shift that had ended late and then been made later by paperwork. He looked tired in the way real work makes people tired. He leaned against the counter with a glass of water and told her that he had been assigned to a rotation that would take him closer to the rail yards. He said it with the same composure he used for everything else. She set down her cup and said that she would prefer not to know the hours. He nodded, understanding the bargain she had held for years. "Tell me what matters. Keep to yourself what will only ask me to wait at the window." Before he left, she reached into the hall drawer and brought out Dan's badge. She set it on the table with the face down and the pin open. The metal was cool and scarred in the way an object becomes honest by use. She told Mick that she had once believed the badge to be a promise from the city to the person wearing it. Now she believed it was a promise the person made to the city in spite of the city. He understood. He closed the pin, turned the badge over, and slid it gently back toward her. He said it should stay where it had stayed, and mean what it had come to mean. The night was quiet when he stepped out. Eva stood at the door a moment longer, then looked down. The threshold was bare. No envelope, no staged object. The absence pleased her. Not all messages needed to arrive as tests. Some could remain unsent. In time, winters became softer and summers meaner. The wall kept its names. New ones appeared at the bottom, the stone taking them with the same indifferent precision that it had taken Dan's. Tourists paused, traced letters they did not know, and moved on. Residents walked by without looking, and then looked back, and then pretended they had not. The city aged into itself, as cities do. Eva aged with it, and did not collapse into bitterness. She did not excuse the men who had made choices that cost her years. She also did not grant them the luxury of defining the rest of her life. She kept the file in good order. She kept the house in good repair. She kept the watch. On certain evenings, she still walked to the courthouse lawn and stood with her hand on the groove of a name that would outlast her. On other evenings, she sat in a chair by the window and read ordinary books about ordinary things. The balance held. Once, unexpectedly, she received a postcard from Piedras Negras. It carried no message beyond a single line. The station is not there anymore. No signature, no return. She turned the card over and studied the photograph on the front. A market, bright with awnings. A crowd, blurred by motion. She placed the card in the folder behind the Polaroid and did not pursue it further. Some information arrives not to be acted upon, but to be recognized. The way a person recognizes a face in a crowd and feels steadier for having named it. Years after that, on a gray morning that threatened rain and kept its threat, she met Pete Mora again. This time not at a diner, but on a bench outside the courthouse. His hair had gone at the temples. His jaw had widened. His eyes had lost the reflex of seeking approval. He told her that certain ledgers had finally been asked for by the right person, and that sometimes an institution makes a correction in one quiet place when it cannot bear to admit the need for one loudly somewhere else. He did not offer names. He did not ask for credit. He only thanked her for keeping paper where it could not be misplaced. She nodded and told him to keep his own notes under his own concrete, and to teach anyone who would listen to do the same. That night she took the Polaroid out once more. She set it beside the badge and the threatening letter and the postcard and the typed form that had checked deceased without support. She added a small label under the sleeve with a line written in the neat hand she had trained across decades. Absence is not the same as erasure. Then she closed the folder, replaced it on the shelf, and turned off the lamp. The next day she walked the courthouse lawn again at an hour when the square was empty. The wall had warmed under a light sun. She laid her palm against Dan's name and counted the beats of her heart, not as a vigil, but as a calibration. Across the square, a patrol car slowed at the light, paused, and moved on. A young officer crossed the far side of the plaza. The belt still looked too new. The stride had the stiffness of someone who wanted to do things rightly, and knew the price of the word rightly would change depending on who spoke it. She watched him pass. She did not call out. The watch did not require announcements. When she reached home, she unlocked the door and stepped inside, and the house made the familiar sounds that had once struck her as loneliness and now registered as belonging. She set her keys in the dish, lowered her bag onto the chair, and moved to the kitchen. She filled the kettle and lit the burner, and stood very still, not listening for anything, not waiting for anyone. The kettle began to whisper, then sing softly. Steam lifted and curled and vanished. She poured, set the cup on the table, and opened a clean notebook. On the first line she wrote the date, and then 2 sentences. The record stands. The watch continues. She let the ink dry and closed the cover, and sat for a time with her hands around the warmth of the cup. The quiet around her was not empty. It was exact. It was the shape of a life that had refused spectacle and chosen steadiness, that had taken what was meant to silence it and used it as ballast, that had handed the next shift forward without ceremony. Somewhere, perhaps, a man with thinner cheeks and eyes trained to distances had learned how to live without being seen. Perhaps not. The truth did not depend on appearing in a photograph or standing on a lawn. It depended on the terms a family had set against a city's reluctance and a department's habits. It depended on paper kept safe and oaths kept clean. The official record would remain what it was. The unofficial one, the one that mattered in the rooms where the lights are honest and the chairs are set square to the table, had been made and kept. The name on the stone would endure. The footsteps beside it would change, generation by generation. The watch would go on, a legacy without spectacle, one night at a time.